All right, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Jennifer Becker, and I'm with our Retirement Planning Department at FAIRWINDS Credit Union from our partners at Majeure Hebert. We have James Lucier.
Good morning.
Good morning, James. He is a partner in the Orlando law firm of Majeure Hebert, PA. He concentrates his practice in the area of intellectual property, business law, media law, eminent domain, and general and civil litigation. Practicing for over 37 years, he's handled cases in trial and appellate stages in these areas, as well as represented clients before regulatory bodies and in arbitration. He serves as an arbitrator for the American Arbitration Association. He's a member of the American Bar Association, the Florida Bar Association, and the Orange County Bar Association. Along with other activities, Mr. Lucier was admitted to the Florida Bar in 1983 and also into the United States District Courts for the Middle District of Florida and Northern District of Florida. That's a lot, Jim. He earned his BA from the University of Notre Dame and his JD from the University of Florida in 1982. And he also served as a helicopter pilot in the United States Navy from 1974 to 83, attaining the rank of lieutenant commander. After law school, he served as a law clerk to U.S. District Court Judge John Reed in Orlando. And today, Mr. Lucier is here to share with us about contract law and something that may be applicable to you at this time. And I'm going to actually turn it right over to Jim to go into the presentation. Jim?
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar brought to you by our good friends at FAIRWINDS Credit Union. My name is Jim Lucier. I'm an attorney with Majeure Hebert in downtown Orlando. And my partner, Joe Percopo, is the inspiration for this presentation. And if you ask any hard questions, I'm going to turn them over to him. Today's topic is called force majeure. It's a topic that is both old and new. It's as old as the four horsemen of the apocalypse: death, famine, war, and pestilence. And it's as new as social distancing and shelter in place. Our particular focus is on the legal importance of force majeure, but the concept starts with non-legal realities. Force majeure is a force you never want to be with you. The dictionary tells us it's French derivation. A superior force is a force majeure. The force can be an act of nature or an act of man. It's a force that's so unexpected and so powerful that it overwhelms and prevents a person from doing or acting. That's a literal translation. Here's some visuals: acts of nature, acts of war, strikes and riots. So, unless you're a weather broadcaster, a journalist, a first responder, or a health professional, when the force is majeure, you are likely to give way, get out of the way, or be unable to act as you prefer. So that brings us to today's force majeure. So ignoring any remaining naysayers who may be out there, who can deny the overwhelming nature of this latest force majeure? We are all experiencing the societal impacts. Apart from the health impacts, apart from the challenges and indignities of daily existence, each of us has probably experienced or may know someone who has experienced a business-oriented impact. And this webinar will discuss legal concepts that are implicated. When the coronavirus upends your plans, whether it's social plans, business activity, family reunions, vacation plans, and the courts are nearly closed, what are your legal rights under the circumstances we face today? Force majeure. Well, first, let's talk about my legal rights. I have to give you a disclaimer. Okay, this is an introductory presentation. It's not a class for credit. It's light on detail and scope. And at the end, we will list some of the many topics and questions that we cannot cover. But I want to give you food for thought. And if it makes you hungry, then you may want to learn more. So, the virus is not anyone's fault. That means that business-oriented impacts, like the one I just showed up, theme parks are closed, have a basic unfairness to them. Okay, this example is automatic withdrawals to pay for annual passes you can no longer use. That was in the news here in Orlando. Tough legal decisions involve balancing unfairness, and sometimes it means imposing perceived unfairness on one party or the other. So, second example happens to be Wendy's. A month ago, they sent notice to landlords unilaterally declaring delays under their contracts because of the virus. Cheesecake Factory, they're not paying rent nationwide. These are impacts, and the questions those landlords, those guests of Disney, those people who are on the receiving end of these decisions are asking is, what is force majeure and how does it operate in Florida? So we started with a dictionary definition, but I'm focusing on the legal concept of force majeure, and it is a legal concept. It's not found in every law book in the sense that it's embedded in every contract and it's automatically a part of the common law. It's a creature of contract. If it's in your contract, it has one meaning. If it's not in your contract, it has a different meaning. And as the slide shows, it's front of mind awareness today, something that people didn't think about 2 months ago. So we're giving you an overview, and here's some of the contract principles we're talking about. It is a creature of contract. So you've got a question, your lawyer's going to ask you for your contract. Got to read the contract. Force majeure. It applies to events that are beyond the control of the party, but that do not have to be impossible to perform. And if you leave it up to a judge to decide the definition because you didn't spell it on your contract, you might get someone who thinks it has to be impossible. And depending on what your contract says, it might only excuse complete performance. In other words, if you can do partial, you need part of your job, maybe you still have to do it. All right, I want to look at a couple force majeure clauses. And the first one is no clause at all. Or what's worse is there's a paragraph that says force majeure and that says intentionally deleted. So if your contract says nothing, the question becomes who's responsible or who has the entitlement to claim injury in the event of non-performance. I can't get to work. How am I supposed to do this contract? Silence suggests that the party assume the risk. So if you're the person who's impacted by the virus and your contract is silent, you could very likely be characterized as someone who decided to run the risk of it happening. And you have no remedy, you have no excuse for non-performance. Now, frustration of purpose is an example of an excuse that has, I'll say it has legs, it isn't guaranteed to work, but if you signed a contract, you have no clause at all dealing with force majeure, maybe you assume the risk, but you can't perform, you can't get the benefit of your contract, total frustration of purpose. And there are arguments that can be made, but risk grows up that you might not survive, that your argument might not prevail if you're depending on someone agreeing with you that frustration of purpose is some inherent right in a contract, because that might be going out on a limb for some judge. Here's another example of a contract, force majeure clause in a contract. Judges construe force majeure contracts under the circumstances they found giving exacting attention to the specific words of the provisions. Okay, so if you define a term, or if you leave something in, if you leave something out, that's going to affect how your clause is interpreted. The one we're looking at here is from the American Institute of Architects General Conditions Contract. It's one of the most widely used construction contracts in the country, and these clauses don't always survive intact. People argue about them or change them, but this is the particular method by which the construction industry, using the AIA contract, deals with certain aspects of impacts, and this particular one deals with delays. So the contract says finish the project by June, but you are delayed. And if you are delayed by labor disputes, fire, unusual delay in deliveries, unavoidable casualties, or other causes beyond the contractor's control, the AIA contract says the contractor can get more time. Now, that's often a good enough result. The contractor wants to keep working. They want to get paid. They want to finish the project. So more time helps them avoid penalties for late delivery. The AIA contract does have a provision that says if there are other damages, they're preserved. But getting more time is very often the solution that people in the construction industry need. So that's how this contract reads. The next example is from a widely used Florida residential real estate contract. And some of you may have noticed in the news just the last couple of days some reports of single-family home buyers who lost their jobs or who had contingencies in their contract that can't be fulfilled. And so they signed a contract that they can't perform, and they want their deposit back. And $5,000, $10,000, or $15,000 can be pretty meaningful to someone who is on furlough from some local theme park. And they were riding high in March, and their ship has sunk in April, and they want their money back. And this particular clause is very favorable to them. This is like I said, this is very commonly used. There are plenty of residential real estate contracts that do not say this. They say something else. And if you're buying from a high volume tract home builder, they're liable to use their own contract, not this one. But this one says non-performance is forgiven if it's by a force majeure. Okay, and it defines force majeure: hurricanes, floods, extreme weather, earthquakes, fire, or other acts of God, unusual transportation delays, wars, insurrections, acts of terrorism, and includes the phrase, which by exercise of reasonable, diligent effort, the non-performing party is unable in whole or in part to prevent or overcome. So that's one of the broadest, fairest phrases you'll ever going to find in a force majeure clause, where in whole or in part performance can be prevented. But it does impose reasonable, diligent effort. You can't just sit at home and cry foul. You got to try to figure out a way to perform. And if you can't do it under reasonable circumstances, performance can be extended for 7 days. And if the force majeure prevents the contract from closing for more than 30 days, then either party can terminate. You don't have to, but either party can terminate and the buyer can get their money back. So how many of you read that when you signed your contract to buy your house? I wonder. But it's nice that it's there. So it's April 2020. You have had an impact on your life or your business, whether it's your vacation plans, you want a deposit back, whether you run a business that operates in conjunction with conventions, you got hotel contracts, restaurants. Can you get out of your contract? Do you want to get out of your contract? Look at your contract. That's the first thing you got to do. If you don't like what you see, keep in mind that you've already signed it. That's the example I'm using right now. This is a contract that's in place, and now you're opening up to see if it has a force majeure clause. And if you don't like what you see, negotiate. And I'm going to tell you a quick war story here from flight school. When they're training pilots, they teach them what to do when you lose an engine. And if you're low to the ground, you can't bail out. And if you lose an engine at night, it's even worse because you can't really see where you're headed. And so they say, look, you're going to have a pretty good idea of where you are, how high you are above the ground. And when you're at 500 feet, your engine is out, you're gliding down for a crash landing, turn on your landing lights. And if you don't like what you see, turn them off. And that's your only choice. Okay. Here, my example, if you don't like what you see in your contract, negotiate. Don't wait. Figure out an approach. Talk to your landlord. Talk to the person. See what you can do. Everyone's in the same boat in the sense that we're all affected by it. And you're going to find out what flexibility is out there if you ask the questions. Last line in this slide says, for your next contract, revise. So you're learning a lesson. Take it to heart. So here's an example. This is fictional. I made it up in its detail, but certainly it's happened again and again in our county. So the example is the trade association canceled its meeting. I'm the meeting organizer, and I've got a convention center contract and 2 hotels and the audiovisual company that was going to help us present some of our presentations. And only the AV company gave us a refund. Why was that? So in each case, contracts required partial prepayments on a schedule. 25% up front was non-refundable. You're never going to see that back. 50% was due 3 months before the meeting, full payment 1 month before. And in this case, the trade association had paid the 75%. Full payment was coming up in a month, but they canceled 2 months out. Can they get their money back? That was the question they asked. The reason for cancellation was the coronavirus, okay? So the convention center contract said that the convention center could cancel if there was a war or hurricane, but it did not give the same right to cancel to the trade association. The convention center kept 75%. Both hotel contracts said the same thing. Hotel could get out if there was a problem, not the customer. Hotels kept the money. So the AV company is a 4-year-old local company, locally owned, 2 UCF grads, 6 employees from Full Sail University. I said this is fictional, but I'm willing to bet that example exists. The AV contract was a form that the owners copied from a textbook, and then they modified with one they borrowed. And it said nothing about force majeure. And again, this is fictional, but I'm willing to bet this example exists. The AV company gave back 50%. You remember the first 25% was non-refundable. They gave back 50%. Because it was the right thing to do, okay? That's not a contract principle. That's a principle of humanity. If your contract doesn't provide it, if you're dealing with someone who they need the money as bad as you do, would be their statement, you sign the contract. Those are the type of discussions you're going to be having if you're trying to get out from under something and you don't have the right to do it. So here's what I'm told is a true case of someone becoming creative. Their contract was not favorable to them. This is a nonprofit organization, $42,000 for a meeting at a hotel, paid in full. And they couldn't get relief. They were denied a refund. No force majeure clause. So they sent the hotel letter. And the letter said, we hate the idea that all that money is going to waste. So we will use our contract. We will fulfill our contract, keep our money. We're going to bring members of the local homeless community to your hotel to use those facilities instead of us. We will bus them in so they can use your beautiful facilities and enjoy the lovely food that only a hotel of your quality can provide. In order to assist us in planning, please help us by answering the following questions. And this is from the body of the letter. And it says, how many people can we fit in your hotel? What's the maximum number of people we can feed? How many people per room? Can we use the pool and the fitness center? By the way, we want to put the name of the contact person on the flyers that we hand out. Whose name should we use? Well, they got a full refund in the mail, okay? So that's being creative. I can't vouch for the truthfulness of this example. The internet is a strange place, but it went around. But think about that notion. Who had leverage in that situation? Would they have actually done it? I don't know. But being creative sometimes requires you to act perhaps against your nature or contrary to the way you might normally think. $42,000 meant a lot to them. So now I've got a slide up that has a clause that has been drafted with the coronavirus in mind, with my examples of conventions and hotels meetings. So it's specific to that type of contract. And it is designed to be reasonable in the sense of not every impact is justifies cancellation, but at some point it ought to, okay? So it includes adding the word disease as a part of the definition of what is a force majeure. You could use pandemic, you could use a variety of terms, pull out the dictionary if you want, but it isn't simply the existence of a disease or an act of war. It must be curtailment of transportation facilities, delaying at least 25% of the attendees, similar cause, including emergency or non-emergency conditions, beyond the control of the parties. And here's where the creativity comes in, that make it inadvisable, illegal, impossible, or commercially impractical. Hold the event. Or for either party to fully perform. Either party. So both sides might be affected, and under those circumstances, terminate without penalty, refund. Okay, fully excuse. That's going to be an interesting clause if you can negotiate it from the hotel that today has a clause saying they get to keep the money. So economic leverage may make a difference in the success of getting something like that, but that's an example of how the lessons we're learning today will play out in the negotiations of the future. So there's a couple legal principles that play out in the enforcement of these clauses, no matter how they're written, and the notion of unforeseeability and foreseeability come in. In other words, if you're trying to cover a risk, you have to kind of foresee whether it could ever happen. But if it's likely to happen, the day you're signing the contract, if you're already at war, it's not unforeseeable. So you're going to have to draft the contract differently if you want coverage for something that's already in front of you. If it's foreseeable on the day, if it's foreseeable because it's active the day you sign the contract. At the same time, most risks are foreseeable if you put your pencil to paper and think about all the worst things that might happen. So you're trying to examine the future, but you can't protect yourself from current risks with a force majeure clause. You have to do that slightly differently. So, acts of war, is that enough? In September 10th, 2001, an act of war, what did it mean? On September 11th, the World Trade Center attack was an act of terrorism. Is that the same thing as an act of war? Not necessarily. Not every court agreed with that. So I brought up the term war, and I'm going to tell you a couple of war stories. These are information examples taken from cases that were handled in my three examples after the 9/11 crisis. And that's probably the more recent example that might be applicable to what people are facing in the future in legal activity associated with the coronavirus. So the first example involved the World Trade Center. And it's a terrible story. The Cantor Fitzgerald company had the top 3 floors. They lost 300 some employees. Terrible story. And they had a fight with their landlord afterwards. And part of the question, it was a very complicated thing, but part of the question was the entitlement of the landlord to keep rent for August 1st through September 10th of 2001. And the court looked at a contract, a very sophisticated landlord, a very sophisticated tenant, and included the language that you see in front of you there, which says due to causes or conditions beyond the control of the Port Authority, which were defined to include acts of third parties for which the Port Authority is not responsible. It also said war. And the court said, well, terrorism is not war, but it's an act of a third party. and the Port Authority certainly isn't responsible for that. And so the Port Authority won that part of the argument, court saying that the defendants are sophisticated commercial tenants who bargained away their right to hold the lessor liable for non-performance in the face of the tragic, unanticipated events which destroyed the building. Harsh result if you're the tenant, I would say, but that's a perfect example of where the courts are often forced to choose between two, depending on perspective, two tasteless outcomes. All right, quick bullet points from a second lawsuit. This is Fort Lauderdale. At an airport, contract was underway, under construction, and 9/11 hit. It was supposed to finish the next month. Because of the delays caused by the airport's reactions to 9/11, they actually didn't finish for 9 more months. Now, the contractor did get time extensions, but the contractor had to sue because they wanted extra money, because every day the construction workers had to go through all sorts of security, heightened security, to get to the job, and it impacted the cost of the job, and the contractor thought he was entitled to more money as a result, considered it a force majeure, impact of terrorism, shouldn't he get more money? The delays were considered unforeseen, but there were numerous provisions in the contract that suggested that any risk of loss for unexpected changes in conditions was assumed by the contractor. Assumption of the risk was the way the contract was drafted. Too complicated to go into here, but the result was that 9/11 did not provide economic relief to this contractor who suffered as a result. Here's a third example, cruise ship. So a pretty generous company wanted to reward its employees, so it booked an entire ship, and they were planning to set sail in October, and they prepaid $892,000. 9/11 came along, and the guests started backing out. They weren't interested in traveling to the Mediterranean to go on a cruise, even if it was free. The cruise ship said, no, we can't change the date, can't have your money back. Contract said nothing about force majeure. And the court, this is a quote from the court, said it's understandable that people were reluctant to cruise, but it does not mean that you can rewrite the contract to insert provisions you failed to bargain for in the original. And that's a statement that applies in contract actions day in and day out in the court. I can't change a contract. That's what you want it to say, but that's not what it says. And the disasters that provoked this problem were not ignored by the court from a human point of view, but from a legal point of view, they could not rewrite the contract simply because of the 9/11 impact. Substitute coronavirus for that. You don't have a force majeure contract, any clause in your contract, judges are going to be hard pressed to give you relief. That's a general statement based on that example. Okay, so force majeure clauses are enforceable. There are certain contract principles that apply. One of them is that unless you've got a very specific, detailed force majeure clause, if the court is just doing with a general force majeure clause, the emphasis is going to be on, did the events that we're talking about, were they beyond the control of the party who's seeking to benefit, and not in their discretion. I just want to give you this quote from a judge who was asked to examine that question, and the judge said, delays caused by excessive rainfall or by the seller suffering a heart attack are not within the seller's control or subject to his whim. No seller can command the sky to open up and more rain to fall, and we are not aware of anyone deliberately inflicting a heart attack on himself to delay the performance of contractual duty. So judges are witty sometimes. That's a creative way to express the notion that beyond the party's control is something you can identify, and I think it's predictable that coronavirus is beyond most parties' control, is a shutdown order that requires you to stay home and makes you unable to operate your restaurant or your non-essential business, something that's beyond your control? I'd have to say yes. If you don't have a force majeure contract, a clause in your contract, and that notion may not help you. But if you do, you're going to have an easy time demonstrating that it's beyond your control. Now, here's one that people are going to wonder about. Many people are going to perhaps argue that I didn't predict this problem, but the courts are not going to accept mistaken assumptions about future events or worsening economic conditions as a force majeure. You did all your proper financial planning, you made your predictions, your business plan looked solid, and all of a sudden the customers had to stay at home. That's economic condition worsening. That's a bad assumption about future events. That's not exactly a force majeure. Sometimes these distinctions become subtle, but you've got to take this concept into account if you are trying to get around a force majeure clause that is not as nice as you would like it to read. Okay, so one of the earlier slides talked about how these clauses are going to be negotiated in the future. So this particular slide that's up now talks about some contract drafting tips, and this is pretty general. I'm not going to be able to cover all industries. This particular one is from the hotel industry, which some of my examples have come from. And so some people would prefer that the cancellation without penalty is only if it's impossible or illegal. In other words, it has to be totally shut down. Partial performance, partial blockage isn't good enough. Okay, so if you're the venue, that's the type of language you might like to have. If you're the customer, the event planner, the trade association, whatever it is, you might want a little more forgiveness. You might want unforeseen events outside of your control that make it commercially impracticable or inadvisable to perform. And you remember the clause that I read a little while ago that talked about if transportation is shut down so that at least 25% of the people can't even get there. That's a very specific example. So the lesson there is think about how your business operates or how your event operates or whatever the situation is, and contemplate some level of performance that makes it impracticable to perform, economically inadvisable to have a party and have nobody come. The third bullet point on this slide says clearly some parties to contracts, the people across the table from you, might want the force majeure events to be narrowly defined. They might not want pandemic or disease in there. They might not want the breadth of some of the clauses we looked at earlier. They might want it simply to be war or acts of God. And that's an old standard clause, and people thought that covered a lot more than it covers. Other people want a longer list, a broader list, or a general list, phrase, or any similar cause. That's lawyers make a lot of money trying to define clauses that are undefined. Any similar cause that can lead to an argument under certain circumstances. But the point is that you would prefer to have leverage under those circumstances and opportunity as opposed to be foreclosed. So if you want the right to get out in the event of the next pandemic or the next problem of major proportions, whether it's a hurricane or whatever, look at your force majeure clause and contemplate how your business operates and what would benefit it in negotiating that contract. So I said earlier that this is an overview. I've been trying to hit the high points, and I'm sure I missed a few, but I know some things I definitely missed, and I'm calling them food for thought. And I just wanted to share a couple things with you that will help you perhaps give perspective to some of these materials and information that I've been sharing. And the first one is Can shelter-in-place order excuse performance of your contract? That's a real important one. And we saw examples of clauses earlier where there was no discussion of governmental activity or illegality, and others where it was very specifically called out. Because guess what? We had the Orange County mayor, the city of Orlando mayor, then we had the governor in sequence tell us all to stay home. And at some point, businesses is affected. You can't perform your contract. My yard got cut yesterday, but there are other parts of my life that were affected. People could not perform their contracts yesterday. So what do you do now? What do you do today? Whether your business is interrupted or your business is down because everyone else is disrupted, those are not necessarily contract questions, depending on what the nature of the disruption is, but it's a broader version of the first question. What are your rights in the event people are not performing the way they were supposed to? Shipment of goods. Can you delay it? Did you really have to have it? So sometimes contracts require notice provisions, and a sophisticated force majeure clause may say you got to give notice of termination, you got to give a reason, you got to express yourself. And what if you get one of those and your contract's silent on force majeure? Or what if your contract says to give notice and the person you're dealing with forgot to give notice? Those are types of questions that arise. Nothing's automatic. And remember, this is a creature of contract. And this is kind of repetitious, but what legal remedies exist when your contracts do not contain force majeure clauses? And we talked earlier about frustration of purpose. If the contract is intended to accomplish something and there's no way it can be accomplished, why would a court force you to pay the money for something you're not going to get? That's a simple example. And maybe laws will be passed. We got a tremendous prohibition against the government interfering with contracts. And I'd be surprised if you could pass a law that says each contract in existence is hereby torn up. Rent for landlords. If you examine the orders, the executive orders that have been issued, it's delayed. Evictions are delayed, but rent is not forgiven. The contracts are not being disturbed, but the procedural remedies that government provides to administer those contracts are being affected for obvious reasons. But when the clouds clear and courts open again, the invoices are going to come out for the past due rent. And what remedies are there? If you're the landlord, you got one remedy. If you're the tenant, you may or may not have another. What remedies might exist? Always starts with the contract. Insurance. Now, I didn't talk at all about insurance, but there's going to be a lot of litigation about insurance, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is insurance companies can afford lawyers, but the clauses were drafted perhaps with 9/11 in mind. Perhaps they favor the insurers, perhaps they're poorly drafted. Insurance contracts that are regulated. So regulators in Tallahassee may have monkeyed with the force majeure clause over the years, and now in the face of the coronavirus, it's awkward. So what common types of, what insurance is there that provides coverage? How do you submit claims? How do you properly design your claim so that you can claim that coverage? What do you do when your coverage is denied? Those are the types of insurance questions that come up today. The other question that may come up today or tomorrow is, where can I get the insurance I really need for the next one? And I just think that the industry is asking itself those questions. This is not the only webinar going on today about force majeure, and there's plenty of webinars going on about insurance. So it's a huge topic, broader than today's topic, this presentation. And this next question is kind of follow up of the first one. What are the arguments going to be about how your particular insurance policy should handle your claim? assuming you have insurance. And I appreciate the opportunity to present. I didn't time this, so I'm maybe a little ahead of schedule, but we got plenty of time for questions if there are any. And I understand Jennifer might have fielded a few. Jennifer, is there something that people are wondering about?
That was great information, Jim. Thank you so much. We do not have any questions at this time. The questions that I had actually had, you answered on the last slide, and that was kind of pertaining to the CARES Act. And we do not have any questions from the audience at this time, though.
Okay. Well, I would say that, the CARES Act, the government response, the Federal Reserve, the things they're doing for the financial industry are not force majeure topics. They're public policy, their economic impacts, it's human nature to want to help in some fashion, and that's why they're not part of this topic. Force majeure is somewhat specific to your business, your contract. It's a word that people like res ipsa loquitur. There's a lot of people throw Latin words out that get misused, and my purpose in this presentation was, frankly, started with a client who said, "Hey, I ought to be able to get this contract. This is a force majeure," and that's the way the question gets asked. And the lawyers start saying, "Well, let's dig into the details," and that led me to do some research for a client, and then this opportunity to put this presentation together came up. But it's exactly the way the real world works in these contexts, and it's an unfortunate situation that, as I said in one of the earlier slides, no one's at fault. Nobody did this on purpose. But now we're trying to figure out how to recover, and appreciate the opportunity to make the presentation.
Well, thank you very much. We definitely appreciate it. We appreciate your partnership as well. And I know you mentioned Joe Procopo. I believe we have him later this month on a webinar as well. So I'm very, very thankful for your partnership. Again, thank you so much. And my name is Jennifer Becker. Like I said at the beginning, I manage part of the retirement planning department here at FAIRWINDS Credit Union. But I want to go ahead and thank you and close this webinar. So unless we have any further questions, thank you so much, Jim and Joe. And until next time, may the force be with you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Bye.
Bye.